So my name's Stephen Kennedy. I'm a principal consultant from Redify. And throughout my career, I've worked as an architect, and I've also had a lot of experience working with architects. Some good experiences, some not so good experiences. And so what inspired this talk to me is really just recognizing the attributes of what I feel makes a good architect outside of purely the technical domain. I think the first thing in terms of an architect is not to get fixated on the actual job title of architect. You might work for an organization that doesn't recognize it as an official role, or just within your team, still as a developer, there are some architectural considerations you're going to want to make that's in the best interest of the business in terms of driving good outcomes. Also, the other thing about architects is a good architect isn't necessarily a good developer. There is an element of different skill sets involved, and vice versa. I'm not going to go into every single sort of area around here, but my feelings around an architect are they kind of sit in the middle of the business and the development teams in terms of not so much playing umpire or arbiter, but more sort of guiding each team in terms of other considerations. They're there to sort of flesh out ideas, make sure the business is getting the outcome that they want, and also making sure that the development team is properly aware of all the business and other implications in terms of their decisions that they're making. To me, the biggest aspect of an architect in terms of what makes a really successful architect is their attitudes and behaviours versus, say, the skills and knowledge that they have. Attitudes and behaviours are far more difficult to grow and to adjust. They require a lot more investment in time and focus. They also require a lot more, at times, humility and self-awareness in terms of how you're portrayed and how you're perceived, particularly when you're trying to influence others in terms of ideas, things that you're trying to change, you're trying to bring about. Skills and knowledge are much easier to learn. There's things like Pluralsight, there's great conferences like NDC where you can learn these things relatively quickly, or you can read a book or a blog post. Whereas attitudes and behaviours is something that's far more, I guess, personal in terms of the way you operate. Some of these attitudes and behaviours I'm going to go through, and one of the big ones is obviously around communication. As an architect, you need to be able to communicate with the business and stakeholders and clients and those sorts of things, not just the development teams that you might have previously been communicating with. One of the things I find really useful, particularly if I'm talking to a new stakeholder or a new relationship, or someone that in an area where I don't quite have the subject matter expertise, is paraphrasing. Even if I'm like 95% sure I understand what the other person is talking about, I'll often paraphrase because assumptions are usually pretty bad in our business, in our industry, and it's best to be concrete, clear. The other thing is, I almost name this slide actually negotiation rather than communication, because a lot of your communication interaction is actually negotiation. It might not be something as formal as negotiating a rate or a license or something like that, but often you're trying to influence and change ideas, and there's an implicit or subtle negotiation that goes on there. And in that, often when you're negotiating, the fact that you feel like you're being heard and understood is almost as important as the actual outcome. And talking about that, it's really important to tie back anything to business outcomes when you are talking to non-technical stakeholders. Often, if you communicate things around, I want to do CI/CD, DevOps with Docker and things like that, they've just got zero interest because they see no buy, they see no value for them. It just feels like technical masturbation to them. They want to know what they're going to get out of it. So some of the things I do, for example, is I've got some buzzwords, just like how we've got industry buzzwords. So I'll talk around return on investment, time to market, cost of ownership, those sorts of things with what they care about. And so you essentially tie an initiative that you're trying to bring across the line, or an approach you're trying to put out, and you tie that back to some sort of business outcome. And that really leads into the last point around, you want to have mutually beneficial outcomes in terms of what you're after, what the development team's after, and what the business and your clients are after. Transparency is something I think, in terms of if you think about the agile principles, it's something that's really important to me. It's, to me, one of the most important aspects. The only problem with transparency is there's not a lot of value in being transparent right at the end of a relationship. The value in transparency is when it's throughout the life of a relationship, a business relationship, or a client relationship, or a relationship with a peer. What I've found if you've got a good transparency with other people is there are going to be issues that come across the line. They might be because of you, they might be because of the other person, or it could have been an external factor. And if you've got transparency throughout the lifetime, then what I've found sort of anecdotally is those issues and things like that are much easier to resolve when everyone feels like they're on the same page. They've got buy-in. They may not have been in complete agreement with each other, but it just makes life so much easier as an architect if you've got a good, transparent relationship. Credibility is obviously something really important to an architect. You are trying to, again, promote ideas and influence and change things. And often at the start of a relationship, it's very difficult to establish credibility. So a good thing to do is to start small. Do little small things. It might be after the first few meetings, taking notes. These are the things I said I would do, and make sure you execute on them when you said you were going to execute on them. And you sort of build momentum that way. One of the things I see in sort of good architects is they're quite task orientated. So one of the things I'll do is I use Outlook a lot within my role. So I will, whenever I've got tasks and things like that, I'll use the task pane with reminders, and I'll set reminders not when the task is due, but based on my capacity, when I think I should probably think about starting that work. Other people use other productivity tools like Trello or Teams or whatever you want. Those are all sort of good habits to get into in terms of building that credibility and that trust with the people that you're trying to influence. An architect is a leader, like sort of the Scrum Master. They're a servant leader. They are there to lead and influence sort of decisions, but they also should sort of collaborate with the teams that they're working with in terms of both the business and the developers. I'm a very big fan of the idea of strong opinions loosely held. So as an architect, what you want to do is you want to have some idea in terms of a vision, in terms of what you're trying to achieve that's going to give the business the best outcome of what they're after. But you should also be open to ideas from people, particularly if you want them to feel like they've got a sense of autonomy and buy-in in terms of what they're producing and what they're doing. You're not the exclusive owner of good ideas. I'm really lucky to work for the organisation I work for, where I work with really smart people. And often my job is not to come up with those good ideas, but to help the team sort of craft and groom those ideas or nurture those ideas into something in terms of just by asking questions. Have you thought of this? Have you thought about what's going to happen when you roll out a new version? Have you thought about what the licensing or the cost implications of doing this are going to be? And what that does is it really empowers others. But there's still one important aspect of, even if you've got loosely held opinions, is you still need a backbone. You still need to have some level of accountability and some level of ownership in what you're asking people to produce. An architect can be a stressful role, and these are not a whole bunch of things that I do. There's just a short laundry list of things. One of the things I do quite often early in a relationship, or if I'm with a new client, is I'll record minutes and actions, not just to build credibility, but to hold both sides accountable in terms of, and also prevents the problem of he said, she said. So there is an overhead in doing that, because after a meeting you then got to do the write-up, and then over time as the relationship improves, then you may find yourself not needing to do this so much. But I find that really useful because if particularly around the requirement side of things, if there's any ambiguity, what I'll often do at the start when I release those minutes is I'll say, at the beginning of the email, I'll say, hey, feel free to sort of feedback if this is not your understanding of what happened in the meeting. Whiteboard architects have got a really bad reputation in this industry, and I think it's pretty well justified. So as an architect, I think it's important you eat your own dog food. I think, particularly if you're rolling out a new sort of set of patterns and practices, sit with the dev team and maybe for a day or two, actually just be part of the dev team and code with them and take on board their feedback around those things. Have you over-engineered it? Have you under-engineered it? Have you not thought of things that they are aware of? It's about working with the people. The other one that I constantly struggle with, and I think most people struggle with, is only worry about what you can control. You can't control everything. You can't control budgets. You can't always control requirements. You're actually not even responsible for the requirements. That's the product owner's job, right? So what you need to be is you need to be very clear around what the area is that you can move in terms of these are my constraints. This is what I'm going to do within those constraints. And finally, you can't take on too much. So it's around being able to delegate, but when you delegate, hold people accountable as well. If they say they're going to do something, make sure they do it. And if they don't do it, then maybe start with just a quiet conversation. And then if it gets worse in terms of them not executing on things, then you might need to escalate or sort of involve more of a group conversation, particularly if it's the group as a whole or a development team as a whole that's not doing what they said they would do. This is my last slide, and really it's something where I feel quite strongly about as well, is don't be afraid to look like an idiot. The two sort of, I guess, psychological areas that we hear quite often in our industry is the Dunning-Kruger effect and also imposter syndrome. And I find a good way of not being guilty of either of those is just to ask dumb questions all the time. Again, assumptions are something really bad in our industry. The other aspect is it also humanises you to an extent, and it makes it easy. You've got a lot less pressure on you if you ask stupid questions, because you don't necessarily feel like you have to be the expert or the gun, And I'm sure, we've got some industry experts around at NDC here, obviously, and they are asked stupid questions all the time. there's very little danger in asking stupid questions, because the other aspect as well to consider is that even if you ask one stupid question in a conversation, you've probably added a whole lot of value throughout the entire conversation in terms of your insights and the other sort of smart questions you've asked. So never be afraid to ask a stupid question. Cool, it's me. I don't know how I'm doing for time, but if anyone's got any questions, I can probably take a few. Nope. Cool. All right.